Hello and welcome to this episode of TPA Talks. We're delighted to have with us Theodore Dalrymple, the author, intellectual and former psychiatrist and doctor. He's had an extraordinary life and he's here with us to talk about things like the arts, university education, bureaucracy, taxation and a range of other topics. Hope you enjoy the episode. Theodore, thanks so much for joining us today. Initially, when I wrote the introduction to this podcast, I was planning on providing some detail about your life and career, but it's so extraordinary and unusual that I think our listeners and viewers will be far more interested in hearing your own description. So if we could just begin with a potted history of your life and career and how your experiences led to your intellectual life.
Well, I became a doctor in 1974. I practiced abroad quite a lot. I've travelled pretty extensively abroad. Lived in Africa for a time, and I became a psychiatrist. And then finally, when I settled down, I became a psychiatrist in a city hospital and in the prison next door. And then I retired and wrote. Well, I wrote before I retired, but I wrote even more after I retired.
I mean, some of those places you visited really are extraordinary. I noticed North Korea, Pyongyang was one of the places, East Timor, some...
Yes, I went to East Timor to do a television. I had a small part in a television program. I crossed Africa by public transport once. That took about 6 months. So I saw Africa from the bottom up. And of course, that is important. It was important to me because it gave me a standard of comparison. Often people don't compare, but that's a mistake because Dr. Johnson said all judgment is comparative. So if you have nothing to compare things with, then you have no sense of perspective. And information without perspective is a higher form of ignorance.
And one of my favourite anecdotes was that you performed Shakespeare to the Crown Prince of Afghanistan.
Yes, my part was very small and inglorious, and there was still a crown prince in those days. He arrived he arrived in, I think it was in Herat, in a silver Mercedes convertible, which was rather unusual in Afghanistan of that time.
Yeah, of course.
And and of course, Afghanistan was much better then than it is now. I mean, the king was a comparatively good person.
One of the things that I read in preparation for this was your book, Our Culture, What's Left of It, which was published almost 20 years ago now. But the really striking thing about it is how much of it feels like it could have been written just last month. So one of my first questions really is how has Britain changed for better and worse since you wrote the works that first brought you into public prominence?
It's difficult for me to compare because I'm not in the same milieu that I was 15 years ago or whenever it was that it was published 20 years ago. But it doesn't seem to me to have changed all that much, either for the better or the worse. Economically, probably it's worse because we've been following idiotic policies for even longer. But I don't think it's changed fundamentally. And as you say, what I wrote could have been written yesterday. And our Life at the Bottom, which was published, I think, in 2001 and is still in print, although I suppose everything is in print these days, that I think could have been written today, which is really depressing because it's not a very happy picture that I paint.
Yeah, of course. A really interesting, very prophetic line in your in one of your books was that a sharp economic downturn would expose how far the policies of successive governments have atomized British society. And of course, since you wrote that, we've had the global financial crisis and then the COVID pandemic. So I was just wondering if you have sort of any thoughts on that prophecy.
Well, no, I think the fundamental point is the same, that what we have done is made human solidarity pass through government. And that's why the situation here is potentially far worse, for example, than it was in the Greek crisis, because the Greeks still have family life and so on and so forth, so that they have alternative forms of solidarity. But for large parts of this country, there's no alternative solidarity to that which the government provides, which is a very cold form of solidarity. I don't really like to call it solidarity at all.
Yeah.
But people are increasingly unable to rely for assistance on other people.
There is the most beautiful line that I'm just going to quote from one of your books on that question of bureaucracy. You said, "When bureaucrats are honest, no one can cut through their Lacanian coils. Their procedures, no matter how onerous, antiquated or bloody-minded, must be endured patiently. Indeed, the very absurdity or pedantry of these deliberations is for them the guarantee of their own fair-mindedness, impartiality and disinterest." It's a really fascinating sort of description of the problems of bureaucracy.
Yes, and to which, of course, I mean, there is an alternative to that. If you have that bureaucracy, and that's corruption. And in these circumstances, corruption could actually be an advantage because it cuts through all that nonsense. Unfortunately, we believe in the honesty of our bureaucracy, but when you believe in the honesty of people who are either incompetent or completely unfeeling, this is not very good. And anyone who has had dealings with our bureaucracies, our welfare bureaucracies, I think will bear out what I say.
And I mean, that brings us on to an interesting area of bureaucracy, and one that the Taxpayers Alliance have really taken aim at, and that we'd love to have your thoughts on. So this is the Arts Council. So this has really blown up as the Arts Council have released their latest list of organisations that will get regular funding. And, you know, I think there's probably an argument for some taxpayer-funded culture, but the problem is who actually provides that funding, and the people that provide that funding have been giving it to theatres such as theatres that have been putting on Drag Time Story Hour for children, and a theatre that's putting on Henry V that has described it as, I think, the height of toxic masculinity and white supremacy. So I was just really interested in your thoughts on sort of the role of funding for culture and bureaucracy and that sort of interplay.
Well, it certainly, I mean, art has always, the production of art has always required patrons. But if you have patronage, you have to have people with taste. And if you have to have people with taste, you have to have people who have some kind of cultural, how can I say, cultural certainty. So that they believe in a culture which they're continuing. The trouble with these bureaucracies is that they set out to destroy culture. A very recent example, I think it was I don't know when, a few days ago at the most, the curator of the Wellcome Institute has taken withdrawn one of the exhibitions, permanent exhibitions there, for the boring. I mean, these people never grow bored with their own thoughts. God knows how they are not bored with thinking these things. I don't know, but of course what they're interested in is power, not truth. But that is what the curator has done, is purely destructive and intended to be destructive, in my view. In fact, the Philistines have taken over the museums. That's the problem. The Philistines are in control. If you look at the Turner Prize, I mean, the problem is that private patrons are now no better than public patrons. So that points, in my view, to a deep cultural crisis. If you look at, there was an exhibition in Paris of the multi-billionaire Pinault, who has restored the Bourse there and put his incredible rubbish in it. And the problem with this is, of course, it's self-perpetuating, because people like Pinault would not want to think that they've been conned. So it has to be maintained. And I think we're in a kind of Macbeth situation where to go or as tedious as to go back is as tedious as to go. So you have to continue this process. Otherwise, you have to admit that for years we've been following a disastrous path, and nobody's going to do that. Nobody in charge is going to do that.
course, and there's of course a big difference between private enterprise and private individuals taking an axe to our culture, and publicly taxpayer-funded organisations taking the axe to the. You could at least do the decency of not charging taxpayers for destroying their heritage.
Yes, that is true. However, I think it does point to a deeper problem, if you like, that even private individuals are unable to distinguish between what has real value and what does not. It's not that nothing of value is produced, it's just that it doesn't become very prominent. Mm-hmm. So there's a big problem there, and I haven't quite got the explanation as to why there should have been this complete degeneration.
Yeah, and I mean, possibly an even more shocking example of this sort of taxpayer-funded culture is another TPA investigation where we uncovered that the government was going to be providing £1.8 million to establish Rotherham as the first children's capital of culture.
But there are lots and lots of these terrible examples, and it's what we expect. Mm-hmm. I went to Birmingham recently, where they built a few years ago a new public central library at a cost of £150 million. What's very interesting about the history of Birmingham Central Library is that there was a magnificent Victorian library which was destroyed with glee, which was knocked down with glee. Then they built a concrete inverted ziggurat, which was unbelievably hideous. And so they had to get rid of that. And I must say the architects of the new library exhibited quite a lot of imagination in building something even worse. I mean, it is unbelievably hideous and vulgar. And when you go into it, you wouldn't know what it was. I mean, you might think it's a nasty hotel in some terrible resort. And this points again to an enormous problem. How is it that when you spend £150 million or whatever it was, but it was a lot of money, you end up with something that is so hideous?
Yeah, I lived in Birmingham during the time, and I remember when the library was initially built. I think because it was so unusual looking, there was a brief period of, oh, isn't this good fun? And then a couple of years down the line, when people have seen it more than once, they realise, okay, perhaps this wasn't actually a good idea. I think something that's only looks good on its first time is possibly not worth building at all. One of the interesting things, to go back to this Children's Capital of Culture that I mentioned, was that the BBC put out a 2-minute segment on it that was essentially a propaganda piece. And so I'd really like to move on to discuss the BBC a bit, because I know that you've written about it and we campaign at length about scrapping the licence fees.
I haven't had a television. I spotted that television was dreadful, so I had no television for 60 years. So I'm not really the person to be a critic of television. But on the very few occasions when I've actually been asked onto the BBC, particularly television, local radio is actually much better. The people who interview you on the local radio are much better, because they have to prepare things for themselves, so they've actually read up about what they're going to talk about. But on television, on so-called discussion programs, I think the BBC is insulting towards the population. It assumes that the population has the attention span of a flea, and cannot stand any discussion that lasts longer than 30 seconds, any contribution. So this is so I have a very poor view of the BBC. Mm-hmm. And not to speak of the bias, of course.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that the Taxpayers Alliance and people sort of within our movement have with the BBC is that for them, impartiality and objective discussion is whether or not we should spend £10 billion on a problem or £20 billion on a problem.
Yes.
Nobody really brings up whether or not actually we should leave this problem to the public themselves. And just on that, I just want to read out something again from your book, which I mean really struck me reading it, particularly given recent events. And you said that the British state has removed several important areas of human life from the responsibility of individuals to arrange for themselves or their families. The income left to them after taxation is thus a kind of pocket money. This explains why, whenever the British government considers a tax cut, almost all newspapers describe the measure as giving money away, indulging in a handout, like a parent doling out a weekly allowance to children. And that really struck me, because the coverage of the Liz Truss tax cuts, ill-fated though they were back in September, was exactly like this. It was all about they were ill-funded, completely unfunded. So I just want to get your thoughts on how things have changed, and perhaps if you have any sort of thoughts or insights on that sort of Truss experiment.
Well, of course, I'm not an economist, but one striking thing is that when there is a small tax cut, I mean, we're talking about very small tax cuts,
yes,
the Chancellor is said to have given money away. Mm-hmm. And even the Daily Telegraph says, the Chancellor has given money away, as if all money were the Chancellor's, and it's by his grace and favour that we have any left. So it is up to him to decide how much money we should be allowed to have. And this has entered the mentality, not surprisingly, because our first duty in the world is now to the state. What I find alarming is that nobody, I mean, it was revealed recently, let me give an example. Recently it was revealed or said that there were 9 million functionally illiterate people in this country. I don't know whether this is actually true. I don't know. I suppose it depends on your definition of functional illiteracy and so on. And so it's not an exact figure, but let us take it as being that 9 million people, adults in this country, are dramatically badly educated, which I think you can see as you walk down the street, actually. Now, when you take those 9 million people, you have to remember that 400, at present figures anyway, 450,000 million pounds has been spent on educating 9 million illiterates or semi-illiterates. Yeah. Well, how is this possible? This is a miracle. I mean, this is astonishing. How can it be done?
Yeah,
years of research must have gone into spending so much with so little result, with a bad result. But nobody seems outraged by it.
Yeah,
I'm outraged by it, both
absolutely,
for the country and for those individuals, because those individuals have a very hard life ahead of them.
Just on this sort of issue of the state failing its citizens, one of the things that you talk about in your writings and as your experience being a GP and a psychiatrist, etc., is that there's so many people in the public make such bad choices when it comes to what they eat, drink, and so on. So I really just wanted to sort of slightly segue onto the issue of the nanny state and where it is and where it's not appropriate for the government to use things like tax and regulation to shift incentives in one way, whether it's hiking up cigarette duty or the sugar tax or these sorts of policies.
You see, I mean, the problem, I suppose, for the libertarian approach is that if you say it's all up to you, then you have to say it's all up to you when things go wrong as well. Now, what we're saying at the moment is all up to you, and we will take care of you when it all goes wrong. So because we will take care of you when it all goes wrong, no one has any other incentive to consider such things as diet.
Yeah, I suppose this speaks to your broader argument that ultimately responsibility has to rest on individuals and families rather than it all resting on the government, which so often has either bad incentives or misplaced incentives.
Again, there are very deep cultural problems which are not going to be solved just by pulling a lever, an economic lever. And part of the problem is that no one will speak the truth about the situation, in my view, or very few people will speak the truth.
One of the areas in which perhaps the government incentivizes damaging life choices is in the easy availability of university education now in this country,
Yes.
with around half of people going to university and lots of people coming out of university with degrees that even in 5 years' time will get them salaries that are below the average salary even for someone without a university degree. So I just want to get your thoughts on sort of the development of university education over the last few decades.
I think it's been, I personally think it's a disaster, and it's actually been a fraud perpetrated on the young. I mean, you would know, you would know more about it. And it's my generation that has perpetrated this fraud. And the problem, I mean, there are lots of problems with it. The problem is that the connotation of a university education remains the same, while the denotation of it has changed completely. So the real meaning of a university education has changed, but people still imagine that having a university degree is some kind of entry into a higher social bracket. And this turns out not to be true. And when they come out of university, they're lucky if they get a job that they could have done when they were 16 with a good basic education. So, and they end up indebted as well.
Just to segue onto another topic before we let you go, there's a lot of talk about the NHS and GPs and exactly how to solve the problem of health spending going up and up and up, and yet outcomes going down. So I was just wondering if you have any insights on that.
I mean, there's a huge amount of bureaucracy going on, so that large quantities of doctors' time are spent on things which don't really have any medical relevance. And what one finds is that if you have administrators, what they do is they don't do the administration, they create administration for others to do. So we have that problem. Another problem that is not much talked about is the feminization of medicine, which means that you have to train at least a third times as many doctors in order to get the same level of work from them. So there's that problem. And it is also true that we have a lower number of doctors than most countries in Europe, I believe, per head. And furthermore, again, dare I say it, by comparison with other countries, they're overpaid. So we learn that, I don't know what percentage it is of doctors who are part-time, general practitioners, I mean, but they obviously can survive economically on part-time work, which suggests that actually what is necessary is a reduction in payment to doctors.
And really, my final question is that imagine that Britain was a patient and that Britain was unwell. What are the 3 things you would prescribe to Britain to bring it back to health?
Well, the first, of course, is that everyone should buy my books.
Well, yeah, indeed.
What would I actually do if I were in power other than resign?
Yeah.
I would cut the number of universities, or university places, but universities, by at least 2/3. What else would I do? I would, of course, try to reduce taxes, but this, I'm afraid, I think it's going to have to be very slow, because we have a situation in which such a large proportion of the population is dependent on government money that you can't just stop it.
It requires a longer term shift, do you think?
It requires a longer term shift. I mean, the idea that we need to increase our productivity is perfectly obvious. I mean, that is perfectly true.
You're still on the hook for one more, I'm afraid.
Well, the other thing is, of course, I mean, with mass immigration, we've had 500,000 people in the last year.
Sure.
I think we have to do something about that, and I think we have to say that we have to be quite clear about it, there are no refugees coming into this country, not in the proper legal sense. And I say this as all 4 of my grandparents were refugees. My mother was a refugee. So I have sympathy for refugees. But the fact is that the people coming into this country are not refugees. And the fact that we don't seem to be able to deal with refugees, with the migrants, is just a sign of the complete degeneration of our public administration. But I would like to do something about that, just as I would also reform the police. We must stop having graduates other than technical graduates in the police, because they've ruined the police. So there's and then, of course, there's our criminal justice system needs reforming.
So you'd be a grand reforming prime minister, I think it's clear.
Nah, I'm not saying I would be a successful one.
Theodore, thank you so much for joining us today. It was greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Theodore Dalrymple for joining us for that episode of TPA Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you share it across your social media channels, like and retweet our own posts, and of course, sign up to our weekly bulletin so you don't miss the next episode.